I know that you thought that Qualcomm made a strong argument in this case, called it a clown show. I believe the judge felt differently, and specifically on a couple of points that you brought up in your criticism of the FTC's position. She said that documents showed that they did kind of push a no license, no chips strategy, that they weren't credible in how they presented on the stand. And of course, Intel has dropped out now of the 5G chip market. Does that change things for you and how you view this case?
So, John, I've been covering these things, for about 30 years, and I think it's a bit of a travesty here, and I think primarily is the FTC and the court didn't show that anybody was damaged. Consumers, chipset makers, and even handset makers. Certainly, Apple is making truckloads of money. There was a lot of competition in there until Intel dropped out. And quite frankly, we've seen cost per megabit go down 10x. So I'm surprised. And it seemed like in the 230-page report, Coe was regurgitating what the FTC was saying. And the issue, though, is that she got a lot of her facts wrong. I mean, even basic stuff like Qualcomm creating device-level licensing, that's factually inaccurate. Ericsson created that. The star witness, Carl Shapiro, the economist, who issued a theoretical based, wasn't even cited in Coe's reaction here. So what this all means is I think there's a very high probability for a stay and an appeal here.
So you think Qualcomm's got a shot on appeal based on, you think they have an argument on the facts here?
Oh, absolutely. The facts of the case that were in the report, the lack of even bringing in the offense, the FTC's star witness, who is Carl Shapiro, who just talked theory. Because to be found guilty of this, you have to not have a theory that you could be anti-competitive, but actually show harm. And facts were that nobody actually got on stage and said that Qualcomm didn't ship us chips because we didn't have an agreement. So I think this is going to be very quickly Qualcomm's already trying to appeal it. I think they'll get a very quick stay, and I think this will be overturned.
Pat, would this, depending on how all of this shakes out, if there's an appeal, et cetera, but would this actually spur more competition?
So I actually don't think it will. One of the remedies that Coe had put in there and the FTC wants is to have get away from the device level licensing into chip level. And what that's going to do is that's going to benefit only the larger handset makers. So the smaller handset makers are going to have a lot harder time arbitrating with all these licenses. So now instead of it being simple with a device, I now have a device for the chip. I have some of the device for the license and then some of the devices for the telecommunications equipment. So to me, this actually is going to lower competition for, decrease competition for the handset makers because it makes their life a lot more difficult.
I guess you could argue that if the market looked differently, if Qualcomm had conducted its business differently, maybe Intel could have made a better go at it, say, in 5G. Granted, they're still in LTE 4G chips, but I guess you could argue that the market entirely would look different if Qualcomm had conducted itself differently, couldn't you?
So I think it's a little bit of a stretch. I think we have a unique situation in tech where the company Qualcomm was so far ahead because they're investing so much more in research. And I don't want to conflagrate research and development. They're very different. Qualcomm has very high R&D. They spend in research to actually invent these technologies. And therefore, I see it as really punishing the person who is ahead by multiple years. There's no other company making the investment that Qualcomm is. So, John, I don't think this would have brought more competition into the market.
Well, for more on the regulatory and political angle to this story, let's bring in AEI fellow and CNBC contributor James Pethokoukis. Jimmy, good morning. What's your take on how this is likely to go from here? The Trump administration seems to be trying to protect Qualcomm.
I thought Qualcomm was supposed to be our national champion in our great global 5G war. Probably doesn't feel like the national champion today, which makes it really odd. I mean, this was a case started in 2017. This is 2 years later. Things have changed, where now we kind of view ourselves in the middle of this tech Cold War, particularly as it results to 5G. And so this ruling is very much at odds with, I think, how the administration views tech companies like Qualcomm.
Yeah, Jimmy, just to dig into that a little bit more, especially this idea of a tech Cold War between the U.S. and China, how would this, if this ruling were to stand, especially if it goes through appeals and a similar, outcome is reached, how would this affect U.S. policy for 5G?
Well, listen, pardon?
In terms of 5G.
Right. So, the administration has sort of been figuring out what it wants to do. There's sort of this perception that we're behind. So it's been sort of running through these ideas, some of which have involved nationalization of some sort or creating some sort of new kind of market for the spectrum. But certainly at the core of this is a belief that U.S. companies should be taking the lead and that companies like Qualcomm really should be, spearheading our effort. And I wonder if, that if we would have done this, if our view of this Cold War was the same 2 years ago as it was today, if we would be here right now. I don't think at this point, even though the administration has kind of attacked big tech more generally and companies like Amazon and Facebook, it also views tech as key to combating China and key to extending our influence in technologies like 5G, where we want to be the ones leading in technology and creating the sorts of standards that are important tomorrow.
Pat, I want to get back to you on the risk that investors should be factoring in here. What do you think of the chances that Apple and others now come back and say, okay, we got these deals, but we want to renegotiate?
Yeah, I do not think that Apple is going to come back in renegotiating. I mean, my understanding is the agreement with Qualcomm is rock solid, independent, literally factoring in anything. And I think the number one thing to Apple is they want to not be a year and a half or 2 years late to 5G. And any mucking with this contract could interfere with that. And the other thing, as part of the settlement, was that Qualcomm and Apple independently dropped all lawsuits around the world. There were literally 50 different IP lawsuits, which Qualcomm had won. I don't think Apple wants to go there. They made a very public declaration that they're in with Qualcomm for at least 6 years. I do believe they're working on their own modem, but I just don't think that's going to happen. Now, Huawei, on the other hand, and this is interesting, I do believe the FTC and Judge Koh handed Huawei and China, gave them a gift today. And I do believe that Huawei, who hasn't been paying Qualcomm everything they should have, they're paying these small little payments, but not in totality. I wouldn't put it past Huawei to start messing with the payments to Qualcomm, even though China's NDRC had been fully approved and the books have been closed on that.